Welcome to the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, you probably noticed this is not my normal surroundings. This is not my office. This is a hotel room because I am on the road. But the show must go on, and the show does go on, and that's what we're doing right now. So I'm going to be talking about a topic. This is something that I have had a few of you ask me in the DMs and even in person at conferences and things. Is how do you start a podcast? And also, should I start a podcast? So I'm answering both of those questions. um, it's so I started writing out an outline for all of this, and I was like, this will be great. It'll be like a little mini-sode. No, it's going to be like 2 full episodes. So this is going to be a series. So look forward to that next week with episode 2. But episode 1, I'm going to be covering like the questions that you need to ask. Actually, before I get into what the episodes are going to be about, there may be some of you who are listening that are just like, okay, I think I'm going to tune out or go listen to another podcast or something because I'm not interested in podcasting. That's totally cool. Don't leave. Don't don't leave though. That's not totally cool. Stick around. What I'm saying is that a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about really pertain to business owners in general, um, about teaching and educating your clients with your expertise. So you may not be, recording a podcast per se, but these tips and tricks and strategy kind of go along with posting on Instagram, doing live videos. If you're doing any videos in like a Facebook group or something like that, you can apply a lot of these principles to that as well. And these questions would be very beneficial for you to ask also. So, back to me explaining what these 2 episodes are going to be about. First episode, which is this one where you currently are right now today. Um, this episode, I'm going to be covering questions that you should ask yourself before you start a podcast. And then also some questions about the podcast, who your target client is, all of that. And then I'll be sharing some important things that I've learned over the last 3.5 years of hosting a podcast. And then episode 2 is going to be a lot more of the tactical, tangible. That's it. Tactical and tangible things like what gear you need, software to record, how do you publish a podcast, all of those kind of things, like the how to of podcasting. And this first episode is the should you do of podcasting. So let's get into it. First question that I would have you ask yourself is, what is your goal for this podcast? We can have different goals of, I just want to share my knowledge, educate other people. That's a great goal. Or I want to make money. I want to turn this into a passive income is not really the correct phrase, but I want to turn this into additional income where, through either sponsors or pointing people toward education that you have that people can pay to use, or with affiliate links, a bunch of stuff. I'll get into all of that later on in this episode and then a little bit more in episode 2. But ask yourself, what is your goal? Is it just going to be entertaining? Maybe it's not a business podcast. Maybe it's just something entertaining and you're going to be talking about pop culture or movies, which is also pop culture, but like movies specifically. Or it's, there's a podcast about cats, and you're just like, they interview cat owners and talk about cat stories and stuff like that, which is great. There is a market for that. There are listeners who will listen to that, and you may be one of them and be like, what is this? I need to go search for this right now. I am not a cat person, so I don't know the name of that one, but search for cat podcast. I'm sure it'll pop up. So are you wanting it to be helpful to others, or like a documentary type process where you're talking about a certain story? Figure out what your goal is and kind of what genre this podcast is going to be. I'm also looking at my notes over here, so don't judge me if you're looking on or watching on YouTube. I am running off of very little sleep right now, so notes are my friend. And notes help me keep this very concise So we're not going on for like 4 hours about podcasting because there's a lot. Um, okay. Episode 1 is where we currently are. Next question. Question 2. Who is your audience? Who are you going to be speaking to? Are they other professionals like you? Are they your clients? Are they just people who enjoy stuff about cats or rom-com movies or something? Whatever your topic is, figure out who your audience is, and just like you do for your business, you create your target client, your ideal client avatar. You want to create a target client or target listener for your podcast. Another question is, do you need a big following? Or this is a question that I get asked. Do you need a big following before you start a podcast? No, you do not. I did not have a big following when I started a podcast, and it's been fine. It's been good. I mean, obviously, if you have 10, 50,000 followers on social media, then whenever you start a podcast, you're going to get a lot of those to listen to your podcast because they like you or they're interested, or maybe, if you're talking about whatever it is that you talk about on social media that they follow you for, then yeah, probably a lot of them are going to follow you. But no, you don't need a ton. You don't even have to have social media to have a podcast, although I would suggest it. Okay. How long should each episode be? This is up to you. I'll share a few statistics about podcasting and all of that. I mean, the 10 to 15 minute range, those tend to be more like either quick tips or little contemplations or some inspirational something. It's just really quick. Here's 10 to 15 minutes. Maybe, it's a good binge. If you're going to be doing multiple episodes a week, 10 to 15 minutes is great. In the 20 to 45-minute range, those are a little bit more longer form, a lot more conversational, a lot more kind of a deep dive into a certain topic. That's where this podcast lies. We push an hour sometimes, but that's just because we're having fun. And then there's other episodes where, if you're pushing an hour 2+, you're talking about like the Armchair Expert or Joe Rogan or something like that, where it's just extremely long form video and audio. And those are very conversational and a multitude of topics. Those are typically, people are listening because either the host is very engaging, which you have to be if you're talking for that long, or they're joining you because the guests that you're bringing on, they're interested to hear what they have to say about just about whatever you're talking about. But the statistics, they show that, or I guess the analytics show that listeners tend to drop off after about 20 minutes. So if you have like a 45-minute podcast, they're only listening to about half of it. Most people. And if you have a 2-hour podcast, most people are only listening to about 20 minutes of it. It still counts as a play, still counts as a download, so it's still good for your numbers. However, if you're trying to look at like completion rate and what percentage of each podcast is being downloaded and listened to, those numbers start to get hurt. But honestly, a lot of people don't even look at those numbers as long as you have the download numbers. Another question to ask yourself is, if you're going to have interviews, should you have interviews? There are some episodes like this one where I'm just talking to you. This is just me. I'm not interviewing anyone. I'm just talking. So you could do something like this where some episodes you're talking to camera, talking to Mike, the microphone, not some dude named Mike. Or you could have a co-host named Mike, and you can co-host a podcast, like I did at the beginning of this podcast for all you OG listeners when this was light and dark back in 2019. I co-hosted with my friend Rachel, and we were able to just like bounce off each other and kind of banter and have that kind of conversation. So, are you wanting to have a co-host? Are you wanting to have interviews? Um, Interviews are great for networking and cross pollination, where you have another podcast host on. So then, whenever they share, their listeners who already listen to podcasts find your podcast and they want to come listen to their favorite host on your podcast, and then maybe they'll stick around if they like you enough. And then you also have the cross pollination where your listeners are going over to their podcast because they're interested after listening to that interview to go check out them. You've probably done that with some of the past guests that I've had on here, like Rachel Traxler or Nathan Chansky, or many others. I've cross pollinated with a lot of other podcasters, and also been on their podcasts, um, to even more cross pollinate. So that's a great benefit of having interviews on your podcast is that helps get your views up and your more reach for your buck. Um, don't always look for a huge follower account when it comes to those guests. Um, I've had some guests that have had 100,000 or more Instagram followers, and then they didn't share about the podcast at all. I have no idea if any of their people listened to it because the downloads slightly changed. And then others who have had like 1,000, maybe 2,000 followers on Instagram, and they share about it. They made reels, they made posts, they talked about it in their stories, and people followed and listened, and it was great. You may be one of those people who heard about this podcast from one of the guests, and then you came over here, and now you're stuck, and now you're with me. But yeah, think about it that way. It's don't just have people who have a giant following base, because it doesn't always mean that their followers are engaged or that guest will share about your show. Let me see. Okay, when should you post? You can post a lot of different times. One thing you want to do when you're posting is be consistent. Whatever you pick, stick with that. So I picked Mondays. Mondays are the day that this podcast comes out. So I've stuck with that. And it's been Mondays for 3.5 years. So you, the listener, whether consciously think of it or not, are noticing that we're there every Monday. So beginning of the week, boom. Oh, look, another Wisdom in the Tangents podcast. I'm going to go listen to this one about podcasting. So be consistent. Weekdays are all about the same when it comes to downloads. Literally, it's almost just even across the board. And that's not just this podcast, my podcast. It is podcasts across all platforms across the world. They're pretty much standard, Monday to Friday, Monday to Friday, weekdays. There is a bit of a spike between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. So whatever time zone you're in, kind of look at that. You can also, once you've been doing it for a little while, you can see where most of your listeners live. If you have, podcasting software, or if you run through like Spotify or something, they're also giving those analytics now. So you can see that. I'll get into that more in episode 2, or part 2. And, but then you can see, I live in Central Time Zone in America, but most of my listeners are Pacific. So I'm going to aim for that 10 to 6 p.m. Pacific time. And that's just, a spike because you're at work. Most people are at work between 9 and 5. So 10 and 6 is right about there. Don't post on the weekends though, because people are enjoying their lives. They're out of work. They're not commuting to work for most of them. And that's just a time that people are not listening to podcasts nearly as much. So stick to Monday to Friday. Pick one of those and just be consistent. Next, this is a little tip for recording. I know that it can be a little overwhelming to record. Um, but it's really helpful if you batch record because it gets you in the mood. You're just like, you're in the zone, you're talking, you're chatting, you're talking to the camera, and then you do one episode, boom, stop. Here we go, pull up my notes for the next one, and bam, we're on to the next. And you can record depending on how long your episodes are. I mean, you could record like 4 to 10 episodes in like a day if you really want to go crazy about it. So those are really good for the solo episodes like this, where I'm just talking to camera. I can record both episodes or part 1 and 2 today, even though they will be released on separate dates. So batch recording is great. That way you're not just like every single week have to find a time to record. But if you do something like that where you just want to do every single week because you don't have 10 episode ideas right now, just want to figure out one at a time, then pick a specific time every week to try and record. You know, if it's like Tuesday evenings after the kids are down, I'm going to go to my office, 9 p.m., pour a glass of something tasty, and just record. And then that's that week's episode. Stay a couple weeks ahead in case a guest pulls out or you have an emergency or something. I used to do this, as you may have noticed this week. Did not have an episode last week because I did not stay ahead. I had reached out to a lot of guests, and a lot of guests were also very busy this month. So they're all scheduling for like a month to 3 months down the road. And I was running out of stuff for right now. And I had already used my emergency supply for a few weeks ago when I had a guest back out, or not back out, but have to reschedule. So um, it's always good to stay a couple weeks ahead of schedule. So that means like if you are in the let's say the first week of May and you're recording with a guest, that episode is not going out the second week of May. That episode is going out at the end of May or maybe the first week of June. You got a whole month between, 4 episodes or so that you can put in between to where you have that buffer just in case something happens. Another quick note, don't expect to hit the top of the charts right away. I know that we hear these podcasts that have millions of downloads and huge fan follower base, and they're like selling merch and all this stuff. And a lot of those are either they have an agency that they're working under, or they are celebrities, because pretty much every celebrity has a podcast now for some reason, because they can make money. That's really the reason, I think. Um, but yeah, a slow build is still a build. You're still growing, even if it is slowly, step by step, brick by brick. You're still building your podcast, you're building your fan base, you're building your listenership. And as long as you stay consistent and you have good quality information and audio and all of that, then people are going to keep coming around to listening. And thank you for staying around and listening. I do have a question from one of the listeners, and a previous podcast guest, and someone that I saw today because we're in the same place right now. Ash Holstein, she asked, what is one of the biggest challenges and what is one of the biggest rewards of podcasting? For me, one of the biggest challenges was finding my voice. I listened to a lot of other podcasts and I found myself kind of trying to be like someone that I listen to, not like consciously thinking, oh, this is how I'm going to talk whenever I'm podcasting. It was just, I listened to a lot of that podcast. So whenever I started talking about topics that were similar, I kind of sounded like that person. Which, if you go back to like I don't know, like episode probably like 50 and before, my voice is a lot higher and like a higher pitch. And I sounded a lot like Adam Mason. If you know Adam Mason from the Bearded Tog, he's since closed down his podcast, but I loved the Bearded Tog. I love Adam Mason. He's an amazing person. And I found myself talking like Adam Mason because I listened to a lot of his content. Um, so one of the challenges was finding my voice, finding who I am behind the microphone. Because again, as I've mentioned on the podcast before, I am fairly introverted. I like people. I like being around people. I like talking. Um, but I don't always have something to say. So being behind a mic, I'm like, I gotta fill all this empty space because people's eyes and ears are on me. Um, so yeah, finding my voice, that was definitely a challenge. Also feeling just intimidated being an interviewer and someone who's interviewing other people, where it was just like, I have to keep this conversation going. If they are not like yes anding me and going on and having, a fun conversation, I have to like pull this conversation together. And that was a lot. It took a lot at the beginning whenever I would have guests like that. It was very draining. And now I'm just super comfortable being an interviewer, even if the guest is um, not giving me much. Luckily, I don't have those guests very often because my guests are fun and we have a great time. One of my biggest rewards for podcasting would be that I've made some amazing friends. I've become friends with a lot of the guests who I've had on the show. Like I'm so currently I am at the Hybrid Collective in Amelia Island, Florida. That's where Ash Holstein is as well, and a few other guests who have been on the podcast, like Layli Amati and Ty Wilson, and getting to see them here, we are friends now. We were not friends before the podcast. I don't even know. Oh no, Ty knew me before, and I think I had met Layli like briefly after a talk that she gave. Um, but now we're friends, and like we took a selfie together, all three of us, and like that has been really rewarding. Is finding my people, finding like-minded people through the guests that I have on the show. And it also helps that, as solopreneurs, we are often very isolated and working by ourselves in our offices, and that's it. So it's really nice to have friendships and to find friends to where I'm not so lonely all at home by myself editing photos. So, yeah, Ashley, thank you for the question. And thank you, everyone who asked about podcasting. That is it for part one. Part two, I'm going to be talking about gear and software and monetization. I've got a whole gear list that I'm putting together, which will be up in the show notes once episode two or part two is live for you next week. But for now, you can check out the show notes for this part of the episode at podcast.allheartphoto.com. As always, you can watch these episodes live, the conversations, not the ones where I'm just talking to camera, unless I just decide to go live that day. But all the conversations, the interviews that I have, you can watch all of those live and ask questions to the guest as well on YouTube by searching for Wisdom in the Tangents. Or there's also a Facebook group called Wisdom in the Tangents Podcast that you can join and be on there if Facebook is your preferred place. But thanks for listening. I hope this was informative. And I'm excited for part two of how to start a podcast and should you start a podcast. Until next week, I'll see you in the podcast booth.